All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. And if you're watching this, if you're watching the recording in the future, thanks so much for tuning in. We are very, very excited and very happy to be welcoming Mr. Bob Schaefer, someone whose work has been enormously helpful to us in the college counseling field. And just really excited that he's able to join us tonight and speak directly to our community and to the students and families that we work with and will be working with in the future. Mr. Schaefer is the executive director currently of the National Center for Fair and Open Testing, which is also known as Fairtest for short. His organization does a lot of work to advocate for fair conditions for students in regards to standardized testing and how students are evaluated. Mr. Schaefer, can you just speak briefly about your work through Fairtest?
Well, Fairtest is a 35-year-old nonprofit organization based in Boston, founded by leaders of civil rights, education reform, student advocacy groups to serve as the nation's independent watchdog over standardized testing and advocate for better forms of assessment. And beginning in the late 1980s, the organization helped nurture and lead the test optional admissions movement, which is what we're going to be talking about on this webinar.
Great, thank you so much. Now, without further ado, I'd like to turn the reins over to Mr. Schaefer. He's going to be giving a slide presentation and introducing just several things, several topics as it relates to the test optional admissions and where the movement began and where it is now and what might be coming in the future. So Mr. Schaefer, I give it away to you.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks to Strive to Learn for the opportunity to do this. I need to get my screen up and share it. And can you see my screen?
Looks perfect. Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, thank you much. So tonight's presentation is called Test Optional Admissions is Here to Stay. Again, I'm Bob Schaefer. I'm the Executive Director of Fairtest, the National Center for Fair and Open Testing. We're online at fairtest.org, where you can find more information about pretty much everything I'm going to address. We're going to start off with a little bit of history of the test optional movement and then talk about the current situation and how it helps students have more choices and have more power in the admissions process. So let's, with no further ado, get started. Not advancing. Let's try this. Oh, I know what the problem is. Hang on. Neglect to push one button. There we go. So, back in the other times before the COVID pandemic, test optional admissions was accelerating very rapidly around the country. In the year before the pandemic, 51 more schools went test optional, the most ever in a single year. And I'll be talking lots of numbers here. There are about 2,330 four-year schools in the country. And we're only talking about 4 universities. Nearly all two-year schools are test optional. They're another route to get into college without the ACT or SAT. You started at a two-year school, a junior college or a community college. You earn your associate's degree, and in many cases, you can transfer into the junior year at a school that would have required you to take the test if you had applied as a freshman. So in the 5 years leading up to the beginning of the pandemic, which is a month and a week ago, 175 more institutions dropped test score requirements. And that included many top arts colleges across the country, places like Pitzer and Southern California, but schools in every region. And we saw a sharp increase in national and regional universities dropping the test. Places on the East Coast like Brandeis and Wake Forest, the University of Chicago in the Midwest, one of the world's most selective colleges and universities, and the University of Denver and so forth all across the country. And as an organization with an orientation towards access and serving historically disenfranchised communities, underrepresented communities, we're pleased to see a wave of public campuses dropping standardized exam requirements. Things like the University of New Hampshire, the University of Delaware, a number of the public campuses in Virginia and the like. So things were on a roll. And then so where we were at, at the beginning of the pandemic, there were 1,070 accredited four-year institutions which would make decisions without regard to ACT or SAT scores, so-called test optional schools. One of those schools, Hampshire College in Massachusetts, was test blind, which means that they wouldn't look at your test scores if you submitted it. And of those 1,070 schools, about 45% of all four-year schools, 360 were ranked in the top tiers of their categories by US News, for whatever that's worth. So more than half of the nation's top 100 national liberal arts colleges were ACT, SAT optional pre-pandemic, and about a quarter of the top national universities did not require all or many applicants to submit test scores. And just to break that down, it was particularly strong in the Northeast, where the movement began. The first test optional school in the country, as near as we can tell, way before my time and others, was Bowdoin University in Maine, which dropped its testing requirements in 1969, 51 years ago. And it started at one end of the country, away from California, and moved through New England, through the mid-Atlantic states, the Southeast, Midwest, and across the country. The point that, again, pre-pandemic, test optional was the dominant admissions practice in the Northeast and the Atlantic coast states north of the Mason-Dixon line. It was beginning to spread west, with some outposts already in the South, Midwest, and particularly on the West Coast. Why was this happening, again, without pre-pandemic? Number of academic studies had shown that test optional admissions was a very good policy. A book called Crossing the Finish Line, Completing College at America's Public Universities, written by the president of Princeton and other major universities, found that high school grades are a far better predictor of graduation rates than SAT scores or ACT scores. That when you rely heavily on those test scores, it has a negative impact on diversity. And what's, I think, most profound for people who believe you need a test scores because you can't tell which school is tough and which is easy, which is true. You don't need test scores, that the strong predictive power of high school grades holds even when we know little or nothing about the quality of a high school an applicant attended. And that helped encourage more schools to go test optional. On top of that, a study was done and now published, available on the National Association for College Admissions Counseling websites, nacacnet.org, at the bottom of the screen, that they looked at in great depth at applicants to 28 institutions with test optional policies, almost 1 million teenagers, and found that when schools went test optional, there was a near universal increase in applicants, a boost in underrepresented minorities and Pell grantees, low-income students, and most importantly, that those students admitted under test optional policies had as good or better graduation rates than students who applied with SAT and ACT scores. Other things that were accelerating the test optional movement, scandal after scandal of particularly overseas, cheating on the tests by people hiring imposters to take the test for them, or stealing advanced copies of the test, that were fed by the testing companies' lazy behavior of recycling old test forms overseas, so that kids who had an opportunity to figure out which test was going to be given again could practice the actual test that they were given. On top of that, and again, about 2 years ago this week, the Varsity Blues scandal broke, and it was a big deal in greater Los Angeles with a couple of Hollywood stars and others being arrested. Today, the soccer coach at UCLA was sentenced to 8 months in prison for taking an $800,000 bribe, part of the Varsity Blues scandal, in addition to bribery, including hiring imposters to take the test and bribing proctors to allow student test scores to be erased and fixed once tests had been given. A couple other things that the College Board started to admit that their test scores really weren't good measures for low-income kids. They had an in-depth rollout of what was called an adversity score. It's now called landscape, but it admits that a 700 in Beverly Hills is not the same as a 700 for a student in Watts. There are differences in opportunity that are reflected in these test scores. If anti-affirmative action lawsuits, which were designed to encourage schools to rely on test scores even more, had exactly the opposite effect when studies showed that relying exclusively on test scores, SAT-only admissions, would result in many fewer minorities of all sorts being admitted. And finally, the University of California system, the biggest and arguably best public university system in the country, had begun a review of its admissions test requirements. And a lawsuit was filed against them to accelerate that process. But the most important force of all was the success of peer institutions that had gone test optional. The admissions profession is like any other set of people. They talk to one another and ask how you're doing. And when a number of schools with test optional policies reported very good results, it encouraged their peers, admissions directors at similar schools, to do likewise. Similarly, admissions directors would move from one school to another, and if they had been test optional at one place and liked it, they took it to the next school test optional as well. So it began to disseminate through the admissions profession because of success. So that's where we were on, say, March 10th, 2020. Come the pandemic. As you know, public classrooms shut, school-based admissions testing sites closed down because of very valid health concerns. The spring and summer administrations of ACT and SAT were largely canceled, though the test takers encouraged kids to risk their lives by keeping some sites open. No one knew when full testing would begin. Colleges closed down. Reopening plans for the fall of 2020 left unclear. Most of them did not open in person. And that left, and I think this is, from our perspective, the worst part, it left teenagers, high school juniors and seniors, their families and counselors left in limbo about the admissions process. With everything else going on in their lives being disruptive, they had no clue to how college admissions would work. And that very quickly led more than 600 colleges in the, say, 4 months from March through July 2020 to announce test optional policies, at least for fall 2021 applicants, current high school seniors. That's on top of the 1,070 schools that were already test optional, with many of those schools going for 1 year suspensions, but others offering 2 or 3 year pilot programs, and some more permanently eliminating scores, and a few going test blind, saying we're not going to look at scores even if you submit them. The list of schools going test optional last spring of 2020, included all the nation's most selective private universities. I've here in California, USC, UCLA, all the Ivies, Hopkins, MIT, Stanford, you name it, it went optional last year. And every public system suspended standardized tests for fall, should have said fall 2020 here, for 2021 applicants, except for the University of Florida system. California went further. By vote of the University of California regents, tests were taken off the table for at least 4 years. With the original plan was to be test optional for 2 years. then test blind, though a lawsuit in which Fairtest was involved forced all University of California campuses, the 9 undergraduate campuses, to be test blind last year. So for current high school seniors, test scores were not considered. And at all UC campuses, save for the University of California at San Diego, that policy will be in effect for the next 3 years. Test scores don't matter for admissions at the UC system. And in addition, because of some lack of clarity about what test optional meant for these schools, 550 admissions leaders, admissions directors, and vice presidents signed a statement that test optional means test optional, that they will not penalize or advantage students who choose not to submit SAT and ACT scores. So where did that leave us? So as of today, I think it's 1,693 bachelor degree granting institutions, 70% of all four-year schools in the country are making decisions about fall 2021 applicants without regard to ACT or SAT scores, about 73, 74%. And for the future, 1,370 schools, no, it's now 1,373 schools have already announced test optional, test flexible, or test blind admissions policies for fall 2022. For current seniors, 6 colleges and universities were test blind. The scores would not be considered. And that included all the University of California system campuses as I mentioned, and all the CSU, the California State University system colleges as well. So now, for the future, a majority of the top 100 national liberal arts colleges are keeping those policies in place, at least for another year, and more than half permanently. Many top 200 of the top 200 national universities will make admissions decisions about high school juniors without regard to test scores. Just yesterday, the University of Kansas announced that it would do so in its entire system. Today, the Chicago Tribune has a story that the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, their flagship campus, is likely to not require test scores again for another year and possibly permanently. The entire West Coast of the United States, California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, and Hawaii, all the public universities in those states are test optional for the foreseeable future. So what's good about test optional? I've mentioned a couple, but let's look at it from the applicant's perspective, from a teenager's perspective. Huge cost savings. You don't have to take the test multiple times or at all if you don't want to. There's none of the additional score send fees and all the other ways the College Board has become $1 billion a year corporation that pays its chief executive more than $1.5 million a year with test taker money. Psychologically, we've talked to hundreds of young people who are so pleased to be evaluated as more than a score. This generation of high school juniors and seniors grew up in the No Child Left Behind era in which they were tested to death. Studies have shown that the average urban high school student graduating this year has taken 112 standardized tests in her K through 12 career. Whatever you think of testing, and we don't think much, 112 is an insane number. You don't need to measure things that well, that often to tell how well they're doing. In addition to that, for many young people, the belief that the SAT, ACT score, filling in bubbles on a Saturday morning, obscures their real talents, and taking that score off the table lets admissions officers see who they really are. And because of the fast growth of test optional and the name brand schools, whether they're publics like the University of California, Berkeley, or private institutions like UCLA or the University of Chicago, test optional schools are no longer viewed as quirky fringe operations or somehow inferior. They're part of the mainstream. And finally, as the pandemic is not over, no test is worth risking any human being's life to take. No student, no test proctor, no custodian who has to open the school and sweep the floors. It's just not worth the risk to take tests for the very little value they add to the process. On the other side of the admissions desk, as I mentioned, that there are a number of research studies. We contributed, Fairtest contributed to it with a book that came out on Teachers College Press, got very little attention because it came out 3 weeks after the pandemic began last year, but it's filled with research data on why we need to drop the SAT and ACT. It's actually widely used within the admissions profession. A report out of Harvard called Turning the Tide talked about the need to eliminate test scores, reduce test scores as a way to take pressure off teenagers. And the early data from schools that were not previously test optional, the 620 or so that went test optional for the first time in the last year, is superb. The data at Berkeley, and I've been an advocate for test optional for years, spoken at Berkeley a couple times. I was shocked by how large the improvement in low income, first generation, and historically underrepresented minorities there were in the applicant pool and in the admitted pool at UC Berkeley once the test score barrier was removed. And this research continues, and we think it will continue to show that test optional admissions works for colleges and works for students. It's a win-win situation. As I said, what happens when schools go test optional, and there are, again, as I mentioned, 51 years of data now, going back to Bowdoin, you get more applicants, and that's certainly been true at many of the test optional schools, including all the ones I've looked at in California. The applicants on average are academically stronger, higher high school grade point averages, better class rank, more rigor in terms of AP courses or IB or whatever. And again, important from Fairtest perspective, more diversity of all sorts, race, but not just race, more first generation kids, more low income kids, more second language applicants, the broader geography, academic interests, and learning differences. You take away the test, and kids who've done very well in high school see an opportunity and take advantage of it. And again, the research data shows no significant difference in the academic performance between test score submitters and non-submitters. So what happens next? We've done the past, the present, and now the future. And this is Fairtest's forecast, and I think it's coming true. The suspension of tests by 620 institutions because of the pandemic created a huge research database of a natural experiment to see what happens. And schools are seeing that data and they're loving it. And school after school is extending their policies. And that is consistent with past practice. A number of schools would pilot test optional policies 5-10 years ago, said we're going to do it for a year or two and see what happens. And almost always that policy became permanent. There's a practical aspect as well. With so many schools not requiring test scores, fewer teens graduating from high schools in each of the 10 years, and COVID-19 uncertainty, many admissions officers that may not like test optional or think they still need the test, they're going to have to remain test optional to continue to be competitive. And again, the experience of the University of California and California State University system. California State University system is the largest public system in terms of number of students in the country. The University of California is arguably the most selective public system. Their data will be widely watched by other states. And as I mentioned, the West Coast states, Arizona, Nevada, et cetera, are remaining test optional as well. So, well, here's what we think the world's going to look like a couple years from now. More test optional, including additional name brands. More studies showing that it's students who apply test optional are just as successful as those who apply with test scores. The factors keep policies in place. Doesn't mean the ACT and SAT disappear. We're Fairtest, not no test, but they'll become much less important in the admissions process, maybe like the SAT subject test or the ACT essay was. Some hyper-selective schools, some publics may require them, but most universities and colleges serving a majority of undergraduates will not. And we hope more schools decouple test scores from financial aid. The reality right now is that there's a seat available in college for any student who wants to go, but many students cannot go because they don't have the financial aid. When schools couple financial aid, merit scholarships, to test scores, they end up giving the lion's share of awards to kids from families that have already had the most advantages in lives. There is a straight line correlation, a strong relationship between test scores, average test scores, and family income. And families with means, even if they don't play the varsity blues illegal games, can buy their kids a leg up by having them take the test multiple times at greater cost, or buying high-priced test prep steroids that boost their scores without necessarily making them better students. And so making aid contingent on those test scores hurts the lower income and minority students who would otherwise succeed if given a chance, and if their tuition was covered in part or in whole. So just to, again, here we are right now, fall 2022 admission. We're talking high school juniors. You name it, it's test optional for next year for the most part. Stanford, I said earlier, USC, UCLA, and University of California system. These are private institutions. There are public campuses, UC, Utah, Washington, Oregon, Texas, all test optional still for current juniors, or test blind. And so finally, what you can do, the listeners or viewers of this webinar, encourage students to consider applying to test optional schools. We have a long list. It's updated several times a week on our website, fairtest.org. You can link to it directly from the homepage, and it shows you where you can apply. And I've seen time and time again students looking at it and go, wow, I didn't know that all those types of schools would let me in without test scores. And promote to young people and their families and their counselors that test optional admissions is a win-win for them and for schools. And finally, we need to rebut some test prep promoters' self-serving fear-mongering. Whisper, whisper, the test really matters, that schools are letting in many more people with test scores than the non-submitters. That's not true based on the data, but they're saying things to keep their businesses. The truth is, optional means optional, and that students should trust that they can apply without test scores and be considered as full, holistic human beings without filling in bubbles on a Saturday morning. So for more information, you can call me. Best to look on our website, where there's tons of background information. There's a chronology of schools going test optional. There's a separate list of schools that are test blind. We're in the process of updating that for next year. You can sort our list by geography if you're interested in applying to a particular part of the country. It's there for your use. And quite frankly, we think that increasing the demand for test optional admissions will encourage more schools to go test optional to meet the needs that students express. So we're glad to work with you. Thank you for listening to this, and feel free to ask us any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Schaefer. Extremely informative. And I just wanted to echo, I have some questions I'd like to ask, but first I just want to echo the Fairtest website that was on the last slide, or the second to last slide. It's very helpful. I have it bookmarked. I check it so often. If you are a student or the parent of a student or the family of a student and you're involved in the college search process, if you're building your list of colleges that you want to apply to or think about applying to, I really recommend including that as part of your search, as part of as a tool that you're using to make a more efficient process. It'll save you time from having to check for every single college you're looking at. And the reason is, as Mr. Schaefer said, there is a full list of colleges and universities that are test optional or test blind. And so you can search, you can browse an alphabetical list. You could, as he mentioned, you can also search by geography. So if you're just want to limit yourself to schools in California, for example, or if you're really interested in getting out of the West Coast and you want to go to, New York or Massachusetts, you can see what the test optional schools are, which there's quite a few on the East Coast, and there have been for a while, as Mr. Schaefer mentioned. There's also something that I really like that I was checking a few times a week at the beginning of the pandemic. There's a chronological list. There's a chronology of when colleges and universities have adopted the policy, and you can kind of see just over time. It's really interesting to track how.
And that chronology is now annotated with how long colleges have said they're going to be test optional if they're not permanent. Some of them, University of Oklahoma, 5-year experiment. So everybody who in high school now, University of Oklahoma is test optional.
Yeah. So there's really great details on there as well. It clarifies, if a school is test blind, if it's a pilot program. I've noticed some really helpful details. So yeah, I just want to make sure to spotlight that again. Definitely use fairtest.org in your college search. So I just have a few questions.
Sure.
Something that you mentioned not in passing, but something that you mentioned indirectly that I think a lot of people probably got, but I just want to ask one more time to clarify the difference between test optional and test blind for those that didn't catch that.
It's a very important distinction. I'm glad you asked that question. Test optional, for which there are 1,650, say, schools, means that if you submit a test score, it will be considered as a factor in the admissions process, along with everything else: your grades, your class rank, the rigor of your curriculum, your extracurricular activities, leadership, community service, family background, etc. Test blind means if you submit a test score, it's going into the trash can. It'll be eliminated from your computer file. It'll be, if it's a physical application, they'll white it out, if there still is white out left in the world. And it does not count. They will not look at it in the admissions process, period. So it is a stronger 100% guarantee that the test scores will not matter. And again, that is the policy for the coming 3 years, at least, at all University of California schools, except for San Diego.
Great, thank you. Now, I wanted to ask if, in terms of the kinds of success stories that you've encountered, in the work that you've done and that you do, I'm kind of just wondering do you have any specific stories of any schools in particular, or any studies, in addition to those that you mentioned on the slides. The defining access is something that I've looked into pretty in depth, and I know that's a really good source of info. But is there anything in addition to that you can point to to share with the audience?
Ira Glass's This American Life, which is the third most popular podcast in the United States, apparently. This past weekend, it's available free on their website, did a profile of test optional admissions, and they looked in particular at students at the University of Texas, which is kind of test optional. If you have graduated in the top percentages of your high school class, test scores don't matter. So maybe it's test blind, really. And they profiled, for example, a young woman of Mexican origin, growing up in San Antonio, which is only 90 miles from Austin, where the main University of Texas campus is. She was, second in her class in high school. She was the first person from her high school ever to go to the University of Texas at Austin. And the data from Texas show that that is a very common characteristic, that, yeah, that you got a lot of high schools. The Texas rule is if you're in the top 10%, originally now 6%, you get automatically admitted to the University of Texas campus of your choice. And so kids from schools on the border with Mexico, in inner city Dallas and Houston, schools that had never sent anybody to the state flagship, suddenly were able to go. And like this young woman, do fine. They needed a little extra support or not. And the Texas has done years of research on this, more than 20 years, and found that those kids do as well as kids admitted with test scores. In fact, they do better than kids with the same high school GPAs and higher test scores who didn't happen to be in the top tier of their high school.
That's great. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. I like that. I like This American Life. You know, I'm a fan of it. I'm not able to listen to every episode, but when I hear something like that where it's something that's of special interest to me, I definitely need to check that out. So
yeah, I mean, they did a nice job. Yeah, they it's This American Life, so they tended to profile elite, highly selective institutions, but but they did do a pretty good geographic diversity and talked about the impact on real human beings, not just numbers.
So something that I want to ask about is something that I think, certain myths that I think are becoming less prevalent, but in recent years, when talking to parents, sometimes students, but primarily parents, there seems to be when I promote the idea of test optional schools or talk about test optional as this great policy, sometimes there's a myth that I come across, or a misconception, that test optional means not competitive, that that it says something about the quality of the education offered at that school. What do you say to that type of misconception or myth?
Well, pre-pandemic, we'd cite places like the University of Chicago and Wake Forest and Brandeis and George Washington and Pitzer and so on that were test optional. Now it's hard to cite a school that isn't test optional among the most selective schools in the country. I mean, for example, Caltech, the California Institute of Technology, one of the handful of most selective and competitive science and engineering schools in the world, is test blind for the next 2 years. If Caltech and University of California, Berkeley, and Chicago, and Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Brown, blah, 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 for people with an Ivy League fixation, can go test optional, anybody can go test optional. And there's no negative connotation whatsoever from being admitted in that route.
So somewhat following up on that question, but in a little bit of a different direction, if you're thinking of an individual student, so again, taking it out of the realm of numbers and into the human kind of element, if you're talking to if you were advising a particular student, and they have to make the decision of, I did take the ACT or I did take the SAT, this is what I got, I want to apply to X college that is test optional. What are the factors that student should think about? Should they ask their admissions counselor?
They should definitely talk to their counselor, whether it is a high school college counselor or an independent counselor or a firm, for advice. Our general advice is, if you have a very strong high school record and will have strong recommendations, and have taken a rigorous course, test scores won't matter at all. If you're more of a borderline student for the schools where you're applying, and you have a super duper test score, that might help you. It becomes a plus factor at a test optional school. And conversely, if you have a borderline academic record, and borderline means still very good, and not so great test scores, I wouldn't send them in. But in most cases, you don't need to send scores at all. And at test blind schools, it doesn't matter.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And in terms of how that plays into financial aid, I think this is something that seems to be a little bit more of a gray area of
Yeah.
understanding for what's publicly available and what's shared. And it's also just seems to be so fluid the last couple of years. I mean, obviously, especially post-pandemic, it's tough to keep up with all the changes.
Yeah, you got it.
Fairtest, as I've been singing the praises, does such a good job of keeping up with test optional admissions policies. How prevalent, to your understanding, how prevalent is test optional financial aid in terms of, merit scholarships that don't require test scores? Does that seem to be a growing movement as well?
It's definitely a growing trend in many schools in the past year that in test optional admissions simultaneously said we won't count test scores in scholarship aid. We actually spent a lot of hours trying to put together those details for schools, and so that applicants could see in one place what kind of scholarships depended on test scores, and we simply couldn't get that much information.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly private universities and public universities in the South have dozens of different scholarship programs, some of which have test score requirements, some don't. In several states, there's test score requirements by law in the state financial aid formula. In Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, there are scholarships that have test score requirements to access them. They're lottery funded or tax dollar funded. So it just very frustrating, but we could not build that database as we hoped because the data simply don't exist in a way that you could get without thousands of human hours to dig out.
Mm-hmm.
So ask your school. Going to their website is not sufficient, as you said, William. The websites just don't have that information. Ask an admissions office or a financial aid office whether you'll be considered without your test scores for financial aid. And in an increasing number of cases, the answer is yes.
Great, thank you. And just one quick follow-up, and I know this may be an unanswerable question, but why do you think it is, just out of speculation, why do you think it is so hard to get that information? Why do they not publish that on the website?
Well, in some places, admissions and financial aid are different things in the process, and one hand doesn't talk to the other. Elsewhere, he's talking. I did several panels with Andy Palumbo, who's the vice president at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, long-term test optional. Now, just this week, test blind permanently institution. And Andy recounts how it took them 2 or 3 years to root out all the places in their system where test scores were embedded as part of the decision-making process, particularly in financial aid. I mean, it's in the last year when colleges have been overwhelmed with all the changes. I mean, they needed to protect their staff from the pandemic, the virus. They needed to figure out how to balance their budget when their schools were closed. They had going on with their student body. Many simply haven't had time to look at their financial aid formula after going test optional for admissions. It takes time. Major changes like this don't happen with a snap of the finger. The diffusion of innovation problem. And over the next couple of years, we're very hopeful that schools will catch up their financial aid policies to be consistent with their admissions policies. But lots did it right from the get-go.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. So just a few more questions. I appreciate your time very much. I know it's the East Coast where you are, and so we're well into prime time. Yeah. So thank you so much. I wanted to ask specifically about the current admissions cycle. I know that we're still in the current admissions cycle. We haven't emerged out of the other side yet, but have you heard any feedback from new test optional schools
well, we've seen numbers from places like the University of California, Berkeley. As I said, they're extraordinary in terms of both increased applicant numbers and increased diversity of all sorts. That is true of selective institutions pretty unanimously. Maybe there may be counterexamples, but everyone I've seen, from places like Tufts on the East Coast to Stanford on the West Coast, have shown, real good numbers because the policy appeals to young people, particularly in the COVID era, encourages people who are very talented academically to apply. Again, on this American Life segment, was a full hour devoted to test optional over the weekend. The admissions directors they talked to said, it wasn't as bad as we thought it would be. It wasn't as hard to make that instantaneous change. Usually to go test optional, a school does a several-year study. They build the process so they can make decisions and create new formulas or measures for kids who don't submit. This schools had to change on a dime from March to July of last year, and it's brand new at a time when staff people may be sick or have to be quarantined because of exposure, and they've done it, and it's worked out surprisingly well, even for its strong advocates like Fairtest.
Mhm.
Very, very pleased.
Good. Well, that's very good to hear. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that.
That's why the title of my talk was "Test Optional Admissions is Here to Stay." I mean, here's an example. The ACT, the other college test admissions testing company, did a survey of admissions directors and concluded that more than half of schools that went test optional last year aren't going back ever.
Mhm.
That came out last month.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
I said test optional works.
Yeah. I saw I think it's the same thing that you're referring to, the ACT organization, the research findings that they published. I think it was just a few weeks ago or a month ago.
Yep.
Yeah. I didn't see the detailed results of that survey, but I would really like to see that.
I think it's if you go to act.org, click newsroom, I think it'll take you to that. They had a private firm do a survey of admissions directors.
So one last question. Something that you mentioned during your presentation, and that I noticed a lot when reading about the test optional movement and the reasons why it is in the best interest of our society and in the best interest of the most people to continue to drop testing requirements and to make them optional rather than required. A major factor is that it seems to really have a really positive effect on students from underrepresented communities and lower income households being able to apply and get into college and go to college.
Right.
In light of that, I want to ask kind of a idealist or a hypothetical question. What with the work that you do at Fairtest and that the National Center for Fair and Open Testing that your organization does overall, how would you imagine the most fair, equitable form of admissions review? What might that look like? I know that's a little bit of a question that might need some preparation or thought, but what do you think that might look like?
Well, one thing Fairtest always says in its critique of standardized testing is one size fits none. And that same is true for admissions policies. The admissions procedure at Caltech is going to be very different than it should be at a liberal arts college, and way different than it will be at an arts college. Each school needs to develop an admissions system that reflects its mission and the type of students it wants to attract. You don't need, unless they want good test takers, you don't need tests in almost all those cases. So it will vary across the lot. We've seen proposals saying, set a minimum set of requirements, courses taken, GPA, rigor, and then do a lottery. not something we've specifically, Fairtest has specifically advocated, but that would probably work. You know, people in admissions at the most selective schools in the country will say that we could admit an entire class of valedictorians or an entire class of 800 scorers on the math SAT, but we don't, because that's not the sole thing we've been looking for, even when we require test scores. These schools need to figure out what kind of students they want and then develop the kind of system that gets them there. And, you know, with all due attention to important societal factors like diversity, like creating paths for opportunities economically, which some schools have been created serious barriers to. I mean, we personally, Fairtest would like to get rid of most forms of affirmative action like legacy admissions that benefit well-to-do white people, that have nothing to do with test scores, which are often ignored for them, or the back doors, side doors, et cetera, that you know, wealthy people use. They're called development prospects, that their kids get in because somebody in admissions or the financial arm thinks that their parents may be good for $1 million. President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, got into school that way. His dad, apparently, his dad, who then ended up in the slammer until being pardoned, was, you know, paid a huge amount of money to an Ivy League college, but, you know, buy a building, let you get your kid admitted. Those kinds of things we'd like to see totally eliminated. Test scores aren't merit, money's not merit, academic talent is merit, and there's a variety of ways to measure it. But you got to take the corrupt systems out of the process to make it more fair.
Absolutely. Well, Mr. Shaver, thank you so much again for taking the time and speaking to our students in our community. And yeah, we're very grateful. And yeah, thanks again. And have a great evening. And
yep, good luck to Strive to Learn.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone for tuning in, and we'll have more webinars coming up very soon. We have one on Thursday in regards to financial aid that my colleague Amanda Merrifield is going to be hosting. And so just keep an eye out and go to strivetolearn.com for more information, and have a great evening to all. Thank you.
Thank you.